was catching up with an old colleague last week, someone who's spent nearly 2 decades in the federal civil service.
Okay.
He's the kind of guy who used to just obsess over regulatory minutia, data integrity.
Right. A real professional.
Exactly. But this time, the man sitting across from me was different.
Yeah.
He was practically vibrating with this nervous energy, talking about the new direction at his agency.
A new direction.
Yeah. He described the atmosphere as electric and finally unified. He kept saying, we're finally cutting through the noise, no more internal friction. And, on the surface, it sounded great. But then I asked him about the sudden dismissal of his department head. A woman we both knew was, arguably the top expert in her field.
And what did he say?
That's when the shift happened. His enthusiasm, it didn't really wane, but it turned cold. He didn't defend the decision with performance metrics or policy disagreements or anything like that.
So how did he defend it?
He just shrugged and said she just wouldn't get in line. You can't have a car with 2 steering wheels. To him, her decades of expertise were irrelevant. Actually, worse, they were a liability because they represented an independent variable. And it just hit me right then.
Right, did.
He wasn't celebrating efficiency. He was celebrating synchronization. He had completely accepted this idea that professional loyalty to the vision was more important than the objective truth of the work.
That specific demand that everyone must march to the exact same drum beat.
Yes. And that any independent institution is an obstacle to be removed. That isn't just office politics. It's a precise echo of a historical process known as Gleichschaltung.
It is a sobering parallel. The term Gleichschaltung, it translates from German as coordination or synchronization.
Right.
And it defines a massive, totalizing historical project in Nazi Germany, primarily executed in this short, brutal burst between 1933 and 1935.
A profound effort to completely rewire an entire country. Not just politically, but institutionally, culturally, everything.
Precisely. The goal was multifaceted, to eliminate political pluralism, to centralize all ideological authority in Berlin, and critically, to dissolve or co-opt every single independent organization.
So purging state institutions, professional bodies, media, education.
All of it. It was about bending everything to serve the regime's will, a point where loyalty to the party became paramount, and it superseded loyalty to truth or law or any established professional standard.
And that really sets our mission for this deep dive. We're going to take a sober look at the analysis, breaking down the historical blueprint of Gleichschaltung, and then seeking out structural parallels and functional similarities and trends we're observing in the U.S. today, specifically those unfolding in 2025.
Exactly. This is an examination of method. So first, we'll lay out the rapid-fire historical mechanics that Germany used. Second, we'll investigate the specific modern trends that, resonate with those mechanics. And finally, we'll conduct a comparative analysis to really understand this concept of structural convergence.
What do you mean by that? Structural convergence.
How methods used to dismantle pluralism can be replicated across vastly different times and places.
Okay, let's start with the sheer speed of that initial consolidation in Germany. The destruction of political pluralism after Hitler became chancellor in January 1933 was, it was breathtakingly fast.
It was done in 3 calculated steps, in just half a year. The first key moment was the Reich Fire Decree in February 1933.
Which was supposedly a response to the Reichstag fire.
Supposedly. But it was used to legally suspend fundamental civil liberties. Think about it. Freedom of speech, assembly, the press just stripped away from the public basically overnight.
And this wasn't just a theoretical suspension. It provided the immediate pretext for mass arrests. They didn't have to debate political opponents anymore.
No, they just imprisoned them.
Right.
Absolutely. The communists, social democrats, the entire organized opposition was politically decapitated immediately, all under the cover of a national security emergency.
And once the opposition was silenced, they delivered the legal death blow.
The Enabling Act, March 1933. That act fundamentally broke the separation of powers. It transferred lawmaking authority from the parliament, the Reichstag, directly to Hitler's cabinet.
Which allowed rule by decree.
It legalized dictatorship. Parliament was just bypassed, which gave the regime legal cover to legislate whatever it wanted. No checks, no balances. And with the opposition arrested and the legal structure gone, the final step was just formalizing it.
The law against the formation of new parties in July 1933.
And there it was. In 6 months, the entire democratic process was legislated out of existence.
So political rivals crushed.
No.
The system of governance centralized. But the state itself, The whole apparatus of government, that needed to be remade. Nazified, as you said, into a perfect instrument of the party's will.
Yes, and that transformation was crucial. I mean, without control over the bureaucracy, the state can't function as a political weapon. The critical tool for this was the law for the restoration of the professional civil service in April 1933.
This was the mechanism for the Great Purge, wasn't it? It let the regime dismiss any civil servant they deemed politically unreliable.
Politically unreliable, or anyone of Jewish descent. It effectively declared that professional experience and objective expertise were now secondary to ideological alignment.
And that prioritization is where the functionality of the state just begins to decay.
It is. We see this so vividly in the small personal stories documented in the analysis, like the experience of Thomas, a mid-level clerk in municipal finance. He saw the dismissal of the senior actuary, Elias, a brilliant statistician who'd held his post for 20 years.
Just gone.
Elias was gone by noon. By the end of the day, his replacement was sitting at the desk. A young, enthusiastic party member who knew nothing, absolutely nothing, about actuarial science.
So the new guy was utterly loyal, but functionally incompetent.
Exactly. Thomas realized immediately that the expertise needed to calculate municipal bond rates or manage state finances was now a risk. The objective truth of the work mattered less than the political optics.
So to keep his job, he had to stop caring about the math.
He had to stop caring about the math and start caring only about the message. This collapse of objective standards in favor of ideology, that's the defining feature of administrative Gleichschaltung.
And to complete that structural overhaul, they just dismantled federalism entirely.
Yes. The law on the reconstruction of the Reich in January 1934 abolished state sovereignty. All power flowed to Berlin, and enforcement at the local level was maintained by Reichsstatthalter Reich governors appointed directly by Hitler.
So all regional checks and balances just gone.
Completely eliminated.
Okay, so the state is centralized, purged, and coordinated. But Gleichschaltung had to reach deeper, didn't it? Beyond government into the fabric of daily life, civil society, unions, clubs, professional bodies.
The trade unions were the prime target there. They represented an organized, powerful base that was independent of the state.
And they were just abolished.
Brutally, forcibly.
Okay.
On May 2nd, 1933, union offices were raided, their assets seized, their leaders arrested or sent to camps. The regime replaced them immediately with the state-controlled German Labor Front, the DAF.
Workers were forced into it, but collective bargaining, the right to strike, that was all gone.
Right. The DF wasn't an advocacy body. It was an apparatus for control and mobilization.
And this action created this profound psychological isolation, what the research calls atomization.
It does. I think the analogy of Carl, a steelworker, is very powerful here. His union hall wasn't just a place to argue for better wages. It was his community center, his third place outside of work and home.
And when the union doors were padlocked?
That independent community dissolved. Carl was now mandated into the DF, marching alongside the factory owner, but he felt profoundly alone. He'd lost that independent organizational buffer that protected him. It left him vulnerable to the regime's absolute power.
And that elimination of all these autonomous spheres, it just extended everywhere. Doctors, lawyers, cultural groups, even sports clubs.
If you could organize independently, you were coordinated. Which brings us to the control of the mind, the ideological colonization of culture and education. They understood that for lasting control, you have to shape how people think, especially the young.
Culture fell under the absolute control of Joseph Goebbels and the Ministry of Propaganda. The goal was explicit, right? To purge anything or anything contrary to Nazi ideology.
And to ensure all creative output reinforced the state's narrative. The enforcement mechanism was the Reich Chamber of Culture, established in September 1933.
And if you wanted to work in arts, music, writing, film, membership was mandatory.
It was. And if you were deemed politically or racially unacceptable, your livelihood was immediately severed.
This created an environment of fear that just colonized the internal lives of professionals. I found the story of Alara, a violinist in Munich, particularly striking.
Tell me.
She wasn't a political person, but after the Reich Chamber was established, she watched her Jewish colleagues and so-called degenerate repertoire modern music just vanish. She kept her job because she was compliant. She was forced to play acceptable anthems, but she felt she had lost her voice entirely.
So the culture hadn't just changed its tune.
No, it had been weaponized. Weaponized to enforce the state's ideology through self-censorship and professional terror.
And that transformation was mirrored in education. Curricula were systematically rewritten to emphasize racial theories, absolute obedience. Teachers had to swear loyalty oaths, and youth groups, like the Hitler Youth, became vehicles for mandatory ideological indoctrination. They were capturing children as ideological subjects from their earliest years.
That is the comprehensive historical blueprint, executed with terrifying speed and thoroughness. So now we turn to the United States in 2025. The challenge is discerning echoes of this blueprint in modern trends. Let's start where they started in controlling the mind. The knowledge infrastructure.
The analysis highlights a coordinated campaign today aimed at neutralizing or dismantling institutions that provide independent, objective knowledge.
Public media, scientific research, libraries.
Exactly. These institutions are vital because they can challenge a dominant narrative with verifiable facts.
We see this in legislative proposals and executive actions, cutting funding for the corporation, for public broadcasting, NPR, and PBS. We see funding for the NIH, specifically areas dealing with climate change or social science, being targeted.
And while the stated justification is often about fighting perceived bias or, being more efficient, the structural effect is ideological discipline. Funding becomes a lever. It pushes institutions toward alignment. It fosters self-censorship to preserve resources. If you cut the funding for independent verification, you weaken the public's ability to critique power.
And this extends to local accessible information centers. We're seeing coordinated national efforts to abolish or severely cut funding for the Institute of Museum and Library Services.
And libraries are being reframed as sites of leftist indoctrination.
To justify censorship and erode public trust in open access to information. Especially around books and programs dealing with race or gender.
This leads directly into the ideological capture of education, which is a direct parallel to the historical Gleichschaltung of the curriculum. There's a deliberate effort to transform the public education system to cultivate a citizenry loyal to a specific nationalist ideology.
At the federal level, the analysis points to the proposed Patriotic Education Fund. This would link federal funding to adopting administration-approved curricula that emphasize a highly sanitized view of national exceptionalism.
And minimize historical injustice.
Yes, paired with mandatory patriotic rituals, with financial penalties for non-compliance.
And this federal push is powerfully reinforced by coordinated campaigns at the local level, electing aligned school board members, passing state laws that restrict how teachers can even discuss race or history or gender.
It creates a climate of fear for educators who might otherwise teach critical thinking skills.
The functional goal is clear: to treat children as ideological subjects, ensuring long-term political support by replacing critical perspectives with these pre-approved, sanitized narratives. It's an attempt at systemic ideological capture.
Okay, so moving to the realm of law, we find parallels in what looks like the emergence of a two-tiered justice system, one where political allegiance seems to determine legal outcomes.
The analysis outlines a stark contrast. On one hand, you have disproportionately harsh sentences for left-leaning protesters, like environmental activists facing very severe charges.
And on the other end, you see mass pardons and commutations for many involved in the January 6th Capitol attack, who are often explicitly framed by political figures as patriots.
This selective application of law is a powerful signal. We also see heightened surveillance, visa revocations, deportations targeting foreign national students involved in specific forms of activism, like pro-Palestinian movements.
So the pattern suggests selective enforcement.
It does. Severe consequences for perceived opponents, and leniency or even reward for loyalists.
And this erosion of equal justice is paired with the institutionalization of Christian nationalism, actively promoting a specific form of this ideology as the defining American identity.
Which effectively creates an in-group and an out-group. And this is institutionalized through pervasive religious rhetoric from high-level figures, appointments of adherents to key government and judicial posts, and policy initiatives in areas like education and healthcare that explicitly fuse this specific religious framework with state power.
It provides a clear moral justification for policies.
And it mobilizes a core base of political support that sees itself as fulfilling a kind of divine mandate.
Finally, then, we turn to the weaponization of government and bureaucracy, using the state's regulatory and financial apparatus against political opponents.
This is a complex area of administrative pressure. Consider the financial asymmetry. Federal investigations into the Democratic fundraising platform Act Blue versus a marked difference in scrutiny for its Republican counterpart, Win Red.
So the effect isn't necessarily a criminal conviction.
No. But it's the imposition of massive legal costs, regulatory disruption, and the public stain of investigation on one side.
It's using the bureaucracy to create friction for your opponents while clearing the way for your allies.
Exactly, and we see this in the targeting of legal and media dissent as well. Public denunciations are often paired with veiled threats suggesting regulatory reviews. The FCC reviewing broadcast licenses of critical media outlets, for instance.
Or the DOJ hinting at antitrust investigations into hostile media companies.
These actions enforce narrative discipline by creating tremendous financial and operational risk for anyone who dissents.
Let's pull all this together using that concept you mentioned earlier, structural convergence. The idea that despite huge differences in time and context, there are functional parallels in the methods being used.
That's the core insight of the analysis. If we map the functional elements of the historical blueprint onto these modern trends, the comparison really reveals the method itself. The Enabling Act concentrated power in Hitler's cabinet. Today we see an increased reliance on sweeping executive orders combined with efforts to weaken judicial review.
And the wholesale purging of the German bureaucracy for political reliability, that mirrors the discussion around loyalty tests, specifically proposals like Schedule F. Can you just briefly explain what that is?
Certainly. Schedule F is a classification proposal that would strip job protections from potentially tens of thousands of career federal civil servants, reclassifying them into policy-determining roles.
Which means?
Functionally, it allows an administration to dismiss them without cause and replace them with political appointees who demonstrate ideological loyalty. It transforms experienced professionals into at-will employees whose careers depend entirely on obedience.
Prioritizing loyalty over institutional expertise, just like we saw with the civil service purges in 1933.
The parallel is functionally identical, even if the legal mechanism is different.
Right. And we also see the dissolution of independent unions in the 30s, paralleled by modern anti-union policies, both aiming to weaken independent worker power.
And the coordination of all media under Goebbels. That contrasts with the modern strategy of defunding public media and issuing regulatory threats to private media. Both intimidate independent information sources to enforce that narrative discipline.
And finally, the Nazification of education contrasts with these patriotic education mandates. The goal is the same, controlling ideology from a young age to ensure long-term support for the administration. The analysis summarizes this emerging U.S. pattern with a specific term, Christian ethno-nationalist managerialism. That's a heavy label.
It is, but it concisely captures the convergence of methods. It breaks down into three components. First, ethno-nationalism, which defines the nation based on specific cultural, religious, or ethnic criteria, creating clear insiders and outsiders.
Okay.
Second, the Christian component, which fuses this specific religious ideology with state power, lending moral and historical weight to policy and institutional appointment.
And the third, the managerialism component. That links back to your opening anecdote, doesn't it? This is the sophisticated bureaucratic use of the state apparatus. Schedule F, regulatory threats, funding cuts to enforce loyalty, punish dissent, and achieve political control. It's synchronized administration.
And the analysis suggests the method of democratic erosion today isn't a sudden, violent coup. Instead, it's the sophisticated hollowing out of democratic institutions from within. The forms remain, elections still happen, Congress still meets, but their fundamental purpose is changed, repurposed to serve the executive will.
So Gleichschaltung is not just history. It's a replicable method, adaptable to any modern context, for dismantling political pluralism.
And the final critical point of the analysis is that collapse can often feel like stability. The erosion of democratic infrastructure doesn't necessarily look like chaos and fighting. It might look like compliance, normality, and administrative efficiency.
It looks like children reciting pre-approved history, experienced professionals being replaced by loyalists, or organizations falling silent because of bureaucratic tweaks, funding threats, loyalty tests, and the generalized silence of those who fear crossing the newly established invisible lines. Recognizing this transformation unfolding within the structures of seeming stability is presented as the most urgent task before reversal becomes impossible.